Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our QuickTake series. Today, I'm joined by Veda Ramachandran, our SVP of Professional Services, to give us an overview of the Logiwa implementation process. Specifically, we're going to talk about our implementation and speed.
Hi, Eric. Nice meeting you here. And just a correction in what you said. While speed is important, I would call it optimal time. Our goal is to make sure that we dot all the I's and cross all the T's from an implementation standpoint, so we have a successful implementation for our customers. So optimal time is how I would call it.
Great call out. So kind of an overview of what we'll discuss today. Definitely want to understand your implementation methodology, as well as discuss what are the factors that will impact the timeline, right? How do we get to optimal and not just focus on speed? And finally, we'll wrap it up with how do we manage that implementation process? So moving on to implementation methodology, wanted to start by just going over the mission of the services team here. Mission is to power our customers' long-term success by turning operational goals into reality through dedicated partnership and transformative solutions. So Veda, how exactly have we prepared our teams to accomplish this mission?
Sure, yeah. So what we do here is we use a framework for our implementation, and we call it IMPACT. IMPACT is an acronym for Initiate, Mapping, Package, Adopt, Commence, and Transition. These are basically the various stages that we take our customers through in our implementation cycle. So it's a proven methodology that we've been using successfully for various customers. That's the method that we would be framework that we would be using for our implementations.
Great. Looks like there's 3 buckets here, right? Initiate and mapping for the planning, packaging, adoption for preparing, and then finally the transition phase. So let's take a deeper dive into each of the steps to understand who the key players are, what the requirements look like, and importantly, what are the outputs of each phase?
Sure. Let's start with the initiate, and then the mapping phase, right? Coming out of the sales cycle, there is a handoff that happens from the account executives and as well as the solutions on the information that's gathered during the sales cycle. So coming out of it, we engage a seasoned design lead who is taking that transition information from the sales cycle and then inject it into our implementation methodology. So the key responsibility that this design lead, who is seasoned in the industry, as the main focus is to make sure that there is a clear understanding with the customer on what the scope is, what they are trying to accomplish, what their high-level goals are, map their requirements into the solution. So there's a solutioning side to it. And then the output coming out of those 2 phases is a well-documented deliverable, which is used as our functional design document. That is our input that goes into the next stages. But the design lead's main focus during this stage is to successfully take that handoff from the sales, work through with the customer, and get the requirements all documented for the next set of phases. So that's the first two phases in the IMPACT implementation methodology.
All right. So at this point, we have the initial config document, project scope, process should be well defined. How does your team typically transition into that next phase?
Sure. The next phase is package and adopt. This is a transition of the customer from a design solutioning phase to the phase which involves configuration in the system based on the agreed flows, testing, and then working with the customer on the various scenarios. You can clearly see, there is a different skill set involved in that. So from a design lead, we transition into a lead consultant or help with a bunch of consultants to help make sure that the functional design document where all the agreed documentation is done is put into reality. And that means setting their account, doing the necessary configurations, working hand in hand with customer through the configuration phase, but also during the testing phase. That's pretty crucial. So this is the the main set of activities that our implementation consultants transitioning out from the design phase would be involved with in these two phases.
Yeah, and you mentioned something there, and it kind of triggered a question. How important is that core testing training and the client involvement, in your opinion?
Yeah, great question. It is huge. It is significant, especially if you look at 3PLs. The implementations are usually a smaller footprint of their clients or their merchants, right? It could be first 5 clients. It could be the first 3 clients. They might have a lot more that they are planning to implement the solution. So the key thing that we see is, as much as a customer is deeply involved during the user acceptance test, working hand in hand with us on fine-tuning the test cases and thereby even learning the system, the more they're equipping themselves in that model, they are very well set for future onboardings. In fact, a lot of our successful customers are the ones who spearhead the remaining clients of theirs, onboarding them into the platform with very minimal or zero support from us. So that phase where they are involved during the testing and during that training period is extremely helpful and is a huge value add that we provide to our customers.
That's really good insight. It's not like we're just going to configure everything and then hand it off to them. I think the approach is very much a train the trainer style. So at this point, the solution is configured. We've done the training and the testing. Can you help walk us through the transition to cut over and go live?
Sure. That's the last 2 phases, commence and transition. So this is when the rubber hits the road, right? You could do all the preparations you can. You've done all the testing you can, but now this is when you are actually, going live. So this involves the taking the customer live on the production system. It also extends into what we call a hypercare. That's a focused implementation services teams support window that we provide exclusive support to our customers post that go live stage, so that they are reaching a level of stability, and coming out of that, they are transitioned into a support model. One of the key things that we do in that transition is what we call our customer success managers. They are introduced into this phase early on. They are actively involved in absorbing the account and understanding the customer's business, but they start taking the front seat when we hit the transition phase. So this is a crucial phase for us. Obviously, support is where the customer lives the longest in the Logiwa family. So we want to make sure that the customers, configuration and setup and testing, go live, hypercare, all tee up to a successful transition where our support teams, led by our CSMs, are taking this customer over for the life of the customer. So that is the last 2 phases that we would be working with hand in hand with our support teams.
Thank you so much, Veda, for that overview. Now, wanted to jump in to start discussing some of the factors that are really critical when it comes to estimating proper timelines for our implementations.
Sure. I think the most important one is scope and complexity. I think we've talked quite a bit about this, in our other conversations. No two customers, they could have the same, the floor space, they could have the same number of items, their business could be identical, but still they are different and unique. So scope and complexity is a key factor that decides timeline. Customers who have a mix of multiple business channels, they're doing B2B and DTC and B2C. Each one of those influence the timeline. So even though in our experience we've seen where we narrow down on how on an average we take customers live, it's a ballpark number and it's a range, but definitely a scope and complexity plays a huge role in deciding how long it takes customers to go live. So yeah, that's critical, and I'm sure there are other things that you'll be covering. So I'm looking forward to what you've seen from the rest of the reasons here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the other one you alluded to it, right, with kind of the approach where for 3PLs in specific, we would start with a handful of merchants and then slowly expand. So that's another consideration. I mean, I think from Big Bang or the phased approach, both options are on the table, but sometimes our customers might be running up against a certain deadline to where a Big Bang is necessary. What's important is I feel like your team is well equipped to handle both methods. Same when we're considering migrating from an existing system. Our favorite word, Veda, cutover.
Yeah.
So simple, sounds so easy, but it's very intricate, right? How do I accept returns for an order that was shipped out of my old WMS, but the return wasn't placed till after we're live with Logiwa? Data integrity concerns. Those are the pieces that we try and pull from sales, but ultimately as the implementation process is underway, constantly revisiting to make sure that we are really, really dialed in on how we're going to migrate that data. And then, of course, the number and then the complexity of the integration needs. If it's marketplaces, an OMS, an ERP system, might look a little bit different versus if we're integrating with a warehouse execution system or different layers of automation.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, those are critical ones, but something that's generally overlooked is the customer readiness and their preparedness, I would say, for the go live. A lot of times we've seen situations where customers are unable to dedicate resources for implementation services, right? Could be other things going on. So it is their availability and how prepared they are to manage change. So change management comes into place. So those form a crucial success factor. And that's something that we talk to customers in our engagements, in our impact phases, to make sure that they are tuned in and they are part of the process. And that's a huge factor that influences timeline as well. So yeah, I mean, it's not a science that or a statistic that you can put together to say this is what it takes. Yes, there are averages. We've generally been fairly fast. I use the word fast, but I'll say fairly optimal in the time that we take to onboard or implement for our customers. But these factors definitely play a significant role.
Definitely. And kind of to take us home, we've discussed our methodology, the different factors, but there's so many moving parts. So how do you and the rest of your team manage this process effectively from that initiate phase all the way to the transition?
Yeah, we use a magic wand. Just kidding. We use a tool that manages each activities under individual phase. It's a project management tool that we use. It's an industry standard. Everyone use their own. But what I've seen is the diligence through which we go through, marking each gating process, going in and coming out of each phases of the impact methodology is clearly documented and managed through a project management tool that we have. This is important for us, not only to keep our side of the story, from an involvement standpoint in check, but on several occasions, we are able to assign some of these tasks that are dependent on our customers' involvement and assign these tasks to them as well through that project management tool. So it gives an overall an overarching project management tool for our activities, as well as for some of those dependent activities that customers have to deliver. So we manage this pretty well through our implementation cycles and use this as our weekly catch up to make a sense of where we stand, how far are we behind, are we on time. Standard project management process, but our tool that we use internally manages that whole thing, and we run it through our impact methodology.
Fantastic. So just wanted to say thank you so much for everyone for joining our quick take today. Thank you, Veda, for your insights. I think it's pretty apparent, regardless of your business, your use case, it seems like we've most likely seen and implemented something similar in the past. And even if we haven't, even if this is something new, we know that we have the processes and the tools in place to venture and partner with you, no matter where your fulfillment journey might take you. So thank you again for the time, and we'll catch you on the next one.
We appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.